So as we look at test planning using our black box and white box approaches, so we're going to apply them into the planning that's going to happen. Um, it's often a testing project is a whole project on its own. Yes, it's normally rolled into a development project, but it's often like its own little beast that kind of starts up when the requirement starts up, and it kind of has its own little development life cycle, and then they kind of meet up at the end when the actual testing happens. Because within testing, I still have to coordinate people. I have to consider tools to either build or buy. I have to have assets, such as servers and databases and monitors and computers and all that sort of stuff that I have to set up to be able to do my testing. And I have to coordinate all this stuff at the same time with my development team that's going on. So we formalize testing mostly because it's expensive. There is a very big cost to doing testing. It's not a throwaway cost. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's unnecessary because, the thing about coding is you're not ever going to get it right. No matter how clever of a developer you are, you're probably not going to fix everything. There's going to be some, I'll call it bug for lack of a better term, and it just be something that needs to be looked at or considered from another viewpoint. So if we can plan for our testing and manage the cost of the testing and don't waste resources later on by a lack of planning, then we can really dramatically improve the results of the entire project. I've been saying for a while at my company, if we want the teams to be more effective, we need to be smarter in our testing. Our development teams, they're not perfect. They're not super efficient, but I can eke out 20% improvement off of the development teams, and it would be nothing compared to a 3% improvement on testing, because we do so much testing and there's such a large amount of testing, because the nature of healthcare and insurance is when I test, I don't just test 1 or 2 test cases, I'm testing 100,000 at a time. I have big files, a lot of data I need to do. So if I can improve the quality, the performance of testing, I can dramatically speed things up and get things done quicker. And if I can test more often and do it, in automated fashion, it's a huge amount of savings that can happen. So as we're planning for testing, there's certain stuff we need to capture. So we absolutely need to know, what are we testing? Of course, we're testing the requirements, right? Well, what of the requirements for testing? We're testing everything. Are we testing both functional and non-functional? Are we doing white box only? Are we black box only? Or are we doing white box and black box? How often we need to test? How often are changes going to be made? Who is going to be doing the testing? What are they going to be doing as part of the testing? So when I say who, of course we want to make sure things are functional, but do we have business partners that's going to be doing testing? Do we have vendors that are going to be doing testing with us? We need to have environments set up for them and when it's going to be done. If you get into IT work, there'll be different, when we say environments, there's something normally called a development environment, which is where developers are off playing. And you have a test environment, we call it SIT, System Integration Testing. Then we have a performance environment, which is almost always exactly the same as production, maybe scaled down slightly. But in order to be able to see how it's going to behave in production, then we have the production environment, which is where it actually runs. And I've been in places that we have more environments on top of that. And each of the environments has a different life cycle of its own. Often when I integrate between 2 systems, I'm not going to go dev environment to dev environment because it's too unstable. Things are changing too often. So I might have to have an environment set up that I have to coordinate changes there, and that's important to manage within testing. That's who needs the information, who needs to be integrated there. One of the big things about that in testing is defining the scope. Now, if I have an app that starts and nothing existed ahead of time, then obviously the scope is everything, because nothing's ever been written before, nothing's ever been tested. But if I go through and I take an existing application and I add functionality, I obviously want to test the new functionality, but I want to test anything that's changed, but do I need to test everything else? Stuff that hasn't changed, stuff that should be working. Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is, we can probably not do that. And that's where some sort of regression testing plan comes into play. That's where the scope of the testing might be dramatically different than the scope of the project. There could be more or less that's going on in testing depending on how things are defined. And then the testing phases are going to be something that I want to align to match up to the scope of what needs to be done. So each testing project is going to use the idea of integration and functional and performance and unit testing and all that stuff slightly differently depending on what the scope of the testing is. And so the testing team needs to accommodate whatever that scope is. So you're going to have developers who are going to be part of testing. Because, I mean, for instance, when I worked on the 767-400 project, there is not an airplane parked in the back lot that we can just go and throw our code into, even if we don't fly the thing. We have to have test harnesses that simulate brakes and flaps and air conditioning systems and coolant systems and there's air conditioning for the passengers, but there's the coolant for the engines and whatnot. And we have to show what happens if an engine catches on fire, or we have to show what happens when the airbags deploy and all that sort of stuff. So we have to have systems that emulate that. So we have to develop those things. We have to have the testers who are doing the actual test creation of the test cases and the test execution. We probably have to have some experts in the business to say, is this actually being done? So if an airplane, you want a pilot to sit down in front of the controls and say, yeah, this makes sense. I could fly this thing. You need administrators to be able to go through and make sure everything's installed and updated and apply patches and all the other stuff that you would have in the other environments as well. So the test team is as extensive and diverse as the development team normally is. And then often, we are going to have many phases of testing. We don't typically sit down and say, okay, it's all ready, let's test. We're going to look at different aspects of the solution as it grows. And we're going to have different stakeholders check out their parts of the solution. So we might have early tests that make sure basic things are functional. We might have other tests that come in and once the functionality is established and it's working right, and then check out the performance. We might have individuals come in of different roles. So we have let's say eBay. When you originally did that, you're going to have sellers come in and see how it works for them. And you'll have individual sellers, and you'll have big corporate sellers. You'll have buyers come in, and you'll have people who are buying in different modes and manners. They're all going to be going on, side by side right there. And it's all going to, as we're looking at, it's all going to integrate with the larger software process. I need to have my testing aligned to my development cycle. I need to align to my release cycle. And that's where you get into the idea of agility, where you're moving away from waterfall and you have these sprints and whatnot that's going to be working on part of it. That's where testing becomes ridiculously complex, because now my testing plan has to have rigor, but be flexible enough to accommodate a varying scope of each testing phase. And so process and documentation is really essential to testing. We want to talk about the minimal things we need to do at each phase in the testing, and then the bars that need to be met eventually for tests to validate that something's ready to go. You can do all the sprints you want to. At some point, you still have to validate that everything still works. Just because I take a test 10 times doesn't mean I have the answers right. I might have got someone right the first time and someone right the second time and whatever, but eventually we need to put all those answers together and have one test that gets turned in. I can't have the combination of all the different tests that you're going to take. I'm using an analogy there, but the point being is, by the time I finish all my software, I need to not only make sure that the last bit of code I added works, but everything that I added along the way. And so testing needs to have a schedule that goes along with it as part of its plan. I need to be able to predict when I'm going to start testing and when I'm going to stop testing. That's going to have to coordinate into the development schedule. I need to know the first time code's going to be released, so I have my test cases ready to go. I need to have my platform for testing ready to go. I can't tell you how many projects I've been a part of where the development team finishes maybe even on time, and then the testers aren't ready because they haven't installed the proper software on their server environment. I've actually seen a project lose a couple weeks because they get to testing and it's like, oh, well, the server's there, but nobody's opened it up yet. Nothing's installed on it yet. We haven't got permissions, for accounts or anything on that. Well, that's ridiculous. That's something that needs to be planned ahead of time. You haven't scheduled that appropriately because sometimes we forget about the aspects of testing as the project. That's a project management fault, but it's also a tester's fault. I can't just think of, I have test cases, I'm going to run them. I have to think of the place I'm going to run them and when they're going to run them and all that stuff as well. So that's the idea of creating the plan, is to put all of these pieces together so I can have a cohesive look at my whole test.